are ready for 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And a little bit of context for the chapter as we're building into this. Again, what's one of the main themes throughout Corinthians? Division of
church.
Yeah, division of the church, division of the body of Christ. And so state that in a positive way. What does Paul want them to do? Yeah, to have unity, right? Yeah, to have unity. Yeah, unity of the body. Unity of the body of Christ. That's the big thing that's going on here. Unity of the body of Christ, and included in this is what we are free to do. Our freedom versus our slavery, right? Are we slaves as Christians? No, right? We're not slaves to any law because why?
Saved by grace.
Yeah, we're saved by grace. We have been set free from the law. Through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, we have been set free from the law. So as Christians, we actually have a freedom. Right? We are free under the law. How are the Corinthians taking that?
Rules.
Not actually, no.
No.
Well, what do you mean?
I think this is where they think they need to be circumcised and all that.
No, that's the Galatians.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the Galatians, right? They have the exact opposite problem with this.
They're
Right.
loud and wicked then.
What's
They're
that?
Loud and wicked?
Yeah, they're saying I have the freedom to do whatever I want. Christ has set me free, therefore I can do whatever I want. Right? So they're viewing this a freedom of fulfilling their desire, right? Their desire or their passion, right? Or you can say passions. Passions is a classical term. The passions are the things that move you, right? So hunger, lust, things like that, right? They can be positive too, like love and other things. Yeah. Right, but anyways, they're just desire or your passions. You're moved by what you desire, right? So that's how they're taking their freedom. But Paul says, no. How does he emphasize freedom? We're free to do what?
Do good works.
To do good works. Yes, that's correct, but we want to be careful of how we phrase this because it's not like it's a false freedom, right? Because that can be understood as a false freedom. Like, oh yeah, you're free, but you have to do this. No, that's not really what Paul's emphasizing. We're free to do what? Starts with an L.
Love.
Love. Yeah. We're free to love. Love God and love neighbor, right? And this is where Paul says, all things are lawful for me, but not all things do what?
Build up.
Edify, build up. Yeah. Edify, build up. Yeah. So we are actually free. That is, we are not captive under a law. We're not facing the punishments of the law anymore because Jesus has died for those punishments already. He has risen again. So we're not driven by the freedom or the slavery of or the fear or slavery under the law. Right? That's not what we're driven by. Now we actually do have a freedom, and we have really a full freedom to love fully. And to not love in a works righteous way to where, okay, I better do this or I'm going to die. But in a, actually no, I'm just free to love. I'm not going to die. I'm free to love. So this is really what Paul centers on a lot, the freedom to love God and to love neighbor. Questions or comments on that before we get into 9? So this is what Paul's really talking about when we get into 9. So now he's been telling all these things to the Corinthians. Now he's going to use himself as example, right? He's going to use himself as example. Can I get someone to read chapter 9, verses 1 through 7?
free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk?
Yeah. All right. So Paul's setting here a contrast between what he has the right to do and what he is free to do. Right? And this he's really contrasting against the Corinthians who are saying, well, I can do whatever I want because I'm free to do it. He's like, no, that's the completely wrong way to look at freedom. Right? So he sets up an interesting thing, especially I think this is an interesting contrast for Americans, because we always like to talk about what we have the right to do. But that's actually not how we should talk as Christians. We have the right to do a lot of things. But what have we been given the freedom to do? Right? And this is really, Paul's trying to change their way of thinking, so let's look at this and see how we can kind of change our way of thinking here. Right? So what does he have the right to do? To eat and drink, right? Eat and drink. Right? That is kind of enjoyment or pleasure. This is kind of what he's talking about here. Right? He has the right. What else does he have the right to do?
Marry a godly woman.
Yeah, man. And you notice, and this goes back to what Paul was saying earlier, right? And Paul makes it explicit here. Earlier, when he was talking about marriage and about staying married to an unbeliever, he did not say, go and marry an unbeliever. This is an important distinction. He said you have the right to stay married to an unbeliever. And so here he makes it very explicit, right? Take along a believing wife, right? He's very explicit about that. Yeah, so a faithful wife. Yeah, to be married. What else does he have a right to do? Now this is an interesting one. You might not think about it this way, but it's what he's saying.
To not work for me?
Yeah, what does he mean by that?
Well, he would be depending on others to support the ministry.
Kind of. So, let's wrap this because we want to be careful. He's not saying he has the right to be lazy. He's saying he has the right to demand payment for what he's doing among them. Right? He has the right to be paid from his work in the church. That's what he has the right to do. Right? Because then he said, and this is clarified by what he says here, right? Who serve as a soldier at his own expense. Do any soldiers just decide, okay, I'm going to use my money that I've amassed and I'm going to go fight wars and not get paid? No. That's kind of stupid, right? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit? Buster? Do you expect to never have any of your cattle to eat, ever? Or your chickens, or anything like that? No, it's ridiculous, right? You don't just work for the sake of working, is what you're saying. You actually get something from it, right? Yeah. Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk, right? What's he saying? He's saying, I, as Paul, as your church planter, as your apostle, I deserve stuff from you. And I have the right to tell you to give it to me. Right? He has the right, really, to get paid. He has the right to get paid, so he has the right to eat and drink. He has the right to be married. He has the right to get paid. Those are his rights. But what does he have the freedom to do? So as opposed to eating and drinking, what does he have the freedom to do? We just talked about this last week, and look just before chapter 9 for the freedom that he has.
He can be careful with what he eats and not to offend others.
I'd say even more extreme than that. Chapter 8, verse 13, therefore if food makes my brother stumble, he doesn't say I'm going to be careful of what I eat. What does he say? I will never eat meat. He has the freedom to never eat, drink, right? He has that's a weird way to think about that. He has the freedom to never eat, drink, and be married. Right? He has the freedom to do that for their sake. He has the freedom, when it comes to being married, to what? To not be married. He has the freedom to remain celibate. And then he has the freedom to what? Yeah, to work for nothing. He has the freedom to not get paid. And not only not get paid, but then also to do what so that he can actually support himself?
Work.
Yeah, to do other work, right? Which was, I think, tent making, right? Yeah. Yeah, he has the freedom to work extra in order to bring them the gospel. That's how he phrases this. This is the freedom that he's been given under Christ. Which involves more work, the right or the freedom? Yeah, the freedom involves like double the amount of work, right? Yeah. And again, this is how we should think about these things, right? Yes, we have the right to do a lot of things. But under Christ, what do we have the freedom to do? And at the heart of all this freedom is again, love, right? We have the freedom to actually love our brother. Right? Questions or comments on that?
Pastor, was Paul married?
Paul was not married. He says so in his letters. In this letter, this is what he's saying, right? And he said it just before this, that he wishes that others have the gift to be as he was, that is, unmarried. He didn't have the burning passion, the burning desire to satisfy the flesh, right? But you notice who is married here. Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? So who is married?
Peter was married.
Peter was married, right? That's Cephas. The other apostles were married. The brothers of Christ were married, right? You have all these people who are getting married. I love that too, because this and other places we see very clearly, even the first pope, which he wasn't really the first pope, was married. Yeah. All right. So, yeah. And then he says, or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Right? That is it only Barnabas and I who have to work to get our living and give you the gospel at the same time? Right? Because that's what Barnabas and him would do. They would work as tent makers in order to provide for them the gospel.
In response to Linda's question, some believe that Paul was a widower because he was actually a Pharisee. And to be eligible to be a Pharisee, some say you had to be married.
I don't
And
think
that's the only.
Yeah. I don't know if that was actually an eligibility, because celibacy was kind of prized among the Jews. He might have been. I don't know.
I've heard that
Yeah.
many suppose that he had been, but he was
We know at least at this point he is not.
right.
Yeah. Anything else on that? Anything else on right versus freedom? understand what I mean there too. Like, especially as Americans, where we have oh, this is my right, this is my right, this is my right. Well, no, as Christians, we actually have the freedom to put our rights aside, right? Which is actually which really it's really the pagan belief that, oh, this is my right, so I'm going to do it, right? That really is historically a pagan belief. That's why you had things like conquerors versus slavery, right? Whenever an area would come in and conquer, it was their God-given right to conquer that place because they're stronger than those people, right? And therefore, it was the right of the people who were conquered to be slaves and to die. Right? That's the pagan mindset, right? But the Christian mindset is actually to put aside my right in order to love, right? That's the Christian mindset. Again, and where do we see that exemplified best? In which person? Yeah, in Jesus himself, right? Who had the right to do what?
To live.
Not just to live, to wipe out everything. Who had the right to completely wipe everything off the face of the earth, including the earth itself, right? And instead put that right aside for the sake of dying for us. Okay. Right versus freedom.
It was on the news this morning or sometime that one of the countries killed a bunch of Christians, like 70.
Yeah, that was the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yeah, right?
So it was.
Yeah, I saw that. That's been increasing there. I think last year they had like close to 400 Christian martyrs. Yeah. It's terrible. I mean, yeah, that stuff goes on all across the world continuously. You don't hear about it, it does. Yeah. But this is why I love the language, especially the language that the early church would use when it was, especially in Rome, when it was illegal to be Christian and they were facing more widespread persecution. So in Revelation, you see the image of all the crowns on the Christians' heads. One, that was explicitly related to the martyr's crown. So you were thought of getting that when you were martyred, right? Two, do you know how they depicted that crown often? Which is kind of neat. As the crown of thorns. And so there's some neat paintings of Jesus literally taking the crown of thorns off of his head and putting it on the martyrs, right? That's kind of a powerful image, right? Everything that goes into that. But yeah, I mean, that honestly is a more realistic view of how Christians should view themselves as, yeah, the world's going to hate me and possibly even kill me, but in this, I'm actually being made to be like Jesus, right? And I'm receiving his very crown, which is the crown of thorns, right? Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Those people have some belief though, too.
Oh yeah. I mean, yeah, may God grant us that faith and resolve to confess so well in a time like that, right? Which, again, and we've talked about this before, that kind of faith does take exercise, right? You don't like Paul will sometimes say, right? You don't or act. It was as our epistle reading that you guys had last week, right? You don't box as one beating the air. You don't run as one aimlessly without the race ahead of you, but you run for a purpose. And so, what does Paul do? He prepares his body for this, right? He actually trains for this, so that when the time of trial comes upon him, he wouldn't be found lacking. Do you remember what are the three main ways we're given to actually train our bodies for these things? We talked about it a few months ago. There's three main biblical ways we train ourselves.
Study the Word.
Yeah, we'll study the Word is more foundational. So that's like the foundation that these three spring from. Yeah.
Fasting?
Fasting,
Prayer.
prayer. One more.
Lord's Supper?
makes sense why you'd be able to undergo that kind of martyrdom a little easier, right? If you're constantly in prayer, you're constantly acknowledging, okay, I'm not enough and God gives me what I need to survive, which is definitely what you need in a time of persecution like that. When you're fasting, you're literally training your body to ignore pain, right, and focus upon God. Again, very, very good thing there. And not only to ignore pain, but to ignore, I already erased it, to ignore desire, to ignore passion, right, and to instead center the heart upon God and His Word. And then almsgiving, right? If you're able to give up your money, then sometimes it's easier to give up your life than to give up money, right? So if you can give up your money, it makes giving up your life a little easier. Okay. Yeah, so we have those three. Back to chapter 9, though. Right versus freedom. Let's keep going a little bit here. Can someone read chapter 9, verses 8 through 12?
Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more?
Yeah, go on to 14, actually.
Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve in the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel.
Yeah, right. We have all of this Old Testament example and even example from life, right? And this is why that term pastor, I think, is really appropriate. Because what does pastor mean? No.
Sure.
No. Lead was closer. Shepherd. A pastor is a shepherd, specifically. Right? So this is like, it's a good example. This is what, the Bible is full of farming analogies. You understand the Bible much better as a farmer than any other profession. Yeah. Right? The law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. I love this question. Is it for the oxen that God is concerned? Right? Does he make that a Levitical law because he's so concerned about the oxen? No. He makes a Levitical law in order to point to something greater, right? Which is the relationship between Christ and the church, and how Christ has ordained ministers to feed his church, right? All right. Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. Again, what does that mean? So when the farmer does the work of actually getting the crop, does he expect to share in the crop? No.
Yes.
When the pastor does the work of actually building up the church and bringing the word to the people, does he expect to share in the fruit of the people? Yeah, he should. Nevertheless, right? Again, this is his right. Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple, and again, Old Testament example, how did even the Levitical priests make their living? From all the sacrifices that were brought in. Right? That's how they got their living. Right. And let's go on a little bit further here. 15 through 18. Can someone do that?
But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision. For I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground for boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting. For necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my own will, if not of my own will, I have a reward. But if not of my,
Not of my own will, I am still entrusted.
I'm still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel.
So either the Corinthians were weaker in faith, or they just honestly did not have that much money, and so what did he do? He made use of his freedom, right? Of his freedom to work harder, to get his own living elsewhere, and to still give these people the gospel, right? And now because he's doing that, and this is kind of where we're going to get towards the latter part of Corinthians, what do they now have the freedom to do now that they're prospering and doing better?
Supporting.
To support him, and not only him, but who else?
Other churches.
Other churches, right? To actually give to other churches as well. Yeah. Right. Yeah. The right, so I don't think he goes into this specifically, but so the right of a church would be to keep its own money and to keep building it up for their own ministry here. That would be the right of a church. But what's the freedom of the church?
Help others.
Yeah, to actually spend their money for the sake of the gospel, right? To actually, and like exactly, I mean, again, a good example is what we're doing with Holy Cross and Saints Peter and Paul, right? Our right is to keep our money to ourselves and to say, hey, you can just come here if you want to hear the gospel. We have the right to do that, but we have the freedom to actually try to get word and sacrament ministry in those communities. All right. Questions or comments on that? There's a little bit more here in chapter 9, which is good on this. Let's go a little bit further here. Can someone read 19 through 23?
For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became as a Jew, in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings.
Yeah. Yeah, this is really the turning point too. He's made so much use of his freedom that he's become a servant, which is kind of weird. But again, where do we see that exemplified most? In Jesus, who made so much use of his freedom that he became a servant, right? Yeah. In order that he might win more of them, right? And so he talks about how he approaches different ones. So the Jews, I became a Jew. To those under the law, I became as one under the law. To those outside the law, I became as one outside the law. He gives a little interesting thing here. He says, not being outside the law of God, but under the law of Christ. So, are we to take this, that Paul, in order to win those outside of the law, lived in lawless living? No. Right? He still lived under the law of Christ. This is a real argument that's made in some Lutheran circles, right? In some Missouri Synod circles. That because of my troubled past, this makes me more qualified to preach to those outside the church. Right? Some prominent people in the Missouri Synod state this. To which we would say, and they would almost use a verse like this to say this. Yeah, I'm becoming all things to all people for the sake of the gospel. Well, no. We're still under the law of Christ. We're still expected to live as Christ lived. That we're not under the law in the sense of, okay, I'm now bound as a slave to something that I have to fear. But I do live under Christ, right? I live under his law and under his love, right? Acting as he acted, right? Yeah. I got in an argument the other day with somebody because I was talking about how, you know, it came up with, you may have heard of this, some organizations that the Missouri Synod has still a tenuous connection to, but used to have a much greater connection to, were using money from the government to harbor illegal immigrants, right? These were certain RSOs. I don't know if you heard of this or not, but that was going on. Anyways, they were accused of fraud, right? And so I got in some conversations with some extended family members about, you know, if we should even be participating in some of these RSOs, these service organizations. To which he said, well, you know, we're doing good works in the community, why shouldn't we do it? And to which I said, if we're doing works apart from the gospel, we're not actually doing good works, right? Again, it's like saying, oh, I'm going to be a lawless person and kind of shows, oh, look, I have a troubled past just like you. No, that doesn't actually do any good for anybody, right? That just holds up an example of lawlessness. But anyways, I was talking with him about this, and kind of along these same lines, right? He was of the argument, because a lot of these organizations, they were created when the Missouri Synod was in fellowship with the LCA, right, which is the precursor to the ELCA. And so, a lot of these organizations are very much social gospel organizations. They're all about, hey, let's make family life equitable. That is, you know, let's make sure if a child feels a certain gender that he can express it, right? That kind of stuff. Let's make sure that that we're, you know, again, what it comes out to is suppressing white privilege and upraising other communities, right? Stuff like that. And so my point was, these are, even though they can be doing some good, quote-unquote, good things by bringing food and clothing to people, right? Stuff like that, they're not good organizations because they are lawless. They're not actually following the law of God or the law of Christ, right? They're doing these things for the sake of their own desires. Does that make sense? Get what I'm saying? Right? So, when Paul says that he's all things to all people for the sake of the gospel, he is not saying, I'm going to do whatever it takes, including sinning, to get people into the church. He's saying, I'm going to actually go among these people and talk to them, right? And actually be able to talk to them for the sake of drawing them into the church. Right? So, again, back before here, if he has a brother who stumbles when he eats certain foods, he's not going to eat certain foods for the sake of the gospel. If he has a brother that he needs to, I don't know, I'll use Paul as an example here. If he has a brother that's outside the church and needs a drive somewhere, he's going to take time out of his day to go drive him somewhere so he can talk to him about the gospel. Right? Not that he's going to agree with that guy, oh yeah, you can do whatever you want, and you know, I drink and smoke too, and all this, you know. You're not going to do that, right? Yeah. Okay. Good there. Or I've heard it before too. Again, this would be a negative example. Well, you know, I could influence this person. This is a weird way of thinking, but it comes from a convoluted way of using this. Well, this person who I care about is really, say they grew up in a strict Catholic upbringing, and so going to church every Sunday has become a law for them that they recoil against. So I'm going to sometimes skip church with them in order to show them that somehow to make them more comfortable in coming to church. No, that's not the way Paul is talking about here. But this is what people fall into, right? This is what people actually will think from this. I've had that real conversation. That's not a hypothetical. That was a real thing. Yeah. All right, and then we get into part of our epistle from this past Sunday, in verse 24. Do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly, I do not box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. And this is part of what's behind this right versus freedom, is Paul has a really good sense of why he's doing what he's doing. And this is what he's encouraging us to do as well. To have a good sense of why we're doing what we're doing. Are we doing what we're doing because I'm somehow fulfilling what I deserve? Or am I doing what I'm doing because I want others to receive the freedom I've been given? We'll pick up there next Sunday, but for now, any last questions or comments on that?